It's Christmas in 2018, and this is a time when people celebrate. You can see the Christmas tree. I don't have the tree up for religious reasons. I guess I have it up because it reminds me of hope and joy. A lot of memories of our four children with the Christmas presents under the tree, and they would all be up at, sometimes 3 or 4 in the morning. But this year's a little bit different. I've been reflecting on my childhood, which was in a city called Rotorua in New Zealand, a geothermal area, beautiful place. And we grew up in a house on a mountainside, and a lot of people thought that I was lucky because we lived in a flash house. But often behind walls, there's often a different story. I heard a psychiatrist a few months back say that all humans are fascinating, that underneath I think he described it as the onion skin, are fascinating and complex layers of a human. But it was just his description of all humans. I had concluded that about 5% of humans are interesting and good people, and 95% go from sort of so-so to shocking. But I wanted to make this video because I wanted to record this particular time in my life. 2019 is going to be extraordinary, possibly for mankind. I've got a petition that I'm taking to the Privy Council in London, and my question that I'm putting to them is basically, please explain the legal relationship between citizens and the people that we trust to govern our systems of state. And the reason I'm taking that petition is because of a long journey. And I'm not quite sure exactly where to start that journey. But I'll try and do that as simply as possible. I left school at 15, I had no qualifications. And I had a very tough childhood. At about the age of 13 and a half, my father came to the school, and he was a complex man. This particular day he seemed very angry. But that was quite normal for him, and so I just got in the car, and when we arrived home and got through the door, my mother was on the floor, covered in blood, and he had beaten her up. And he said that he was calling a family meeting because she had got herself pregnant, not to anyone else, but to him. And then he wanted a vote on whether or not she should have an abortion. By this stage, I had my my mother's head on my lap. I was wiping the blood off, I'd done that a number of times before, and she had done it to me. The mountain that I grew up on, there was a bush, and I used to spend a lot of time up there, away from home. Forgive me. I spent a lot of time up there just to escape. And I was only about 8 years old, and I used to sleep up there to get away from the screaming, the violence. The violence was so bad sometimes, you know. My father would have the gun out and he'd be threatening to kill Mum. But she stuck with it. You know, she had the dream that things would come all right. She was always so loving. She was hard-working. Really hard-working. She was a nurse. She bought her first property, I think, when she was 16. And she was the sort of the breadwinner in the house. My father just gambled, went to the horse races and drank huge amounts of alcohol and womanized, and then came home, and Mum would have a beautiful dinner on the table. We didn't have a lot of money. But she tried, and just something would be said, nothing particularly bad. He'd just turn the table upside down, all the plates would go everywhere. I got so used to it. I used to sometimes just know when he was about to go off, and I would save my meal by grabbing my plate. Every Friday night we used to have fish and chips, and we would have a piece of fish each and chips. And because the fish was the precious item, my brother and sister used to go for the fish first, and I would go for the chips. I knew that my fish would still be there, so I'd get a good feed of chips in. And I guess I realised at that stage that my life was going to be different. Anyway, I left school at 15, and it was, you know, I just had to get away. And I came to Australia when I was 18, and I started life as a chef. My mother had encouraged me to do that, to get a trade and, you know, have something to fall back on. Just one second. So I worked 2 jobs in Melbourne at once, and you know, to begin with, I was working 7 days a week, and everything was good. And my mum came over to visit, and that was really lovely. But I'd bought a painting. I paid $5,500 for it. It was by an artist by the name of Hans Hyson, and Mum was annoyed with me. She said that she was disappointed, and I said, "It's a good investment, Mum." And I sold it a few days later, and I made a few $1,000s profit. And Mum was inspired. She had an upholstery business, and one day this is about 6 months after being with me in Australia, back in 1980, 81, some people called in to drop off a couch. There was a deceased estate, and they were going to take the couch to the tip, and they saw the upholstery shop. And they called in and they said, "Do you want the couch?" And Mum said, "I'd love to." And there was other stuff on the trailer, and Mum noticed some paintings, and she was inspired by my investment in art, and she thought the paintings looked good, and they were good. They turned out to be by an artist by the name of Maud Burge, and she had about 20 of them, and she sold them from sort of a minimum of about $800 right up to about $4,000 each, and these were on the way to the tip. But Mum, being Mum, she tracked down the people, because she said, "I think these are valuable," and they didn't want them, but she said, "Look, if I get any money, I'd like to give you some." So Mum gave half, and that's the sort of person she was. Sometimes when food would be short on the table, I used to notice her plate was empty. And she just made sure that we were fed. You have to forgive me, but my mum's dying, and I can't be there. It's sort of hard for somebody who doesn't know the situation to understand why, but I want to try and just at least get that down on record. But anyway, Mum went back to New Zealand, of course, and I persevered in Australia, and I did a trip back to New Zealand, and my father had confronted me. It was always sort of this us and them. You're either on my team or you're not on my team, and he grabbed me around the throat, and I didn't want that. I mean, I did boxing and I did martial arts and all that, and some friends and family and others have said that I should have just taken to him, but I didn't. I guess I sort of realised in watching him beat us up that you don't do that to family. You try and, as Mum always taught, reach out with some love. Anyway, it had a profound effect on me, and when I went back to Australia, I found myself living on the streets up in King's Cross, Woolloomooloo, Potts Point. And sometimes I'd sleep in the parks, and other times I would stay at hostels. Often with no money for food, I'd eat at the Hare Krishna, and you had to go through the talk first, though, before you got a free meal. I guess the lesson in that was there was never a free meal. But one night, I went to bed, but it was before I went to bed. I was walking past the Wadeside Chapel, and there was a young lady. There was a group out the front, maybe 20 or 30 people, and there was a lady playing a guitar. And she looked at me and she said, "Jesus will touch you tonight." I didn't think anything about it. And during the night, I just had this saturation of white light. And I found myself bolt upright, laughing just with this enormous joy. And I didn't know what had happened. But that day when I got up, I went into a serviced office complex, level 21, 44 Market Street. And a young entrepreneur by the name of Ian Yates, he rented the floor and subleased the offices, made money out of that while he ran his property business. And I sat down and I spoke to him, and I said that I had an idea for setting up a food brokering business, that I trained as a chef, and I knew that nobody in hotels or kitchens were good negotiators, and that I felt that I'd be able to, earn a percentage off the suppliers. And that I had no money. And I didn't tell him much about my life, but I think he enjoyed my enthusiasm. And he got up and he reached in his pocket and he took his wallet out, and he gave me $300, and he gave me a hug, and he gave me hope. He gave me hope. Anyway, he organised an office for me, no cost. Just when you get on your feet, He just said, it's just all about paying forward, doing the right thing. Well, anyway, within a short while, I had enough money to catch a taxi from the hostel at 25 Hugh Street, Potts Point. It was a room that I would share with often up to 3 or 4 other people, bunks, but it was, it was cheap. And so I moved to a building called the Park Regis, and my apartment was level 41, 27 Park Street. And I worked my business and I made some money. And then one day I went to the elevator and I was supposed to go for a meeting with my accountants, Chapman and Eastway. And for some strange reason, I didn't push the button down. There was just something in me that made me push level 45, where the laundry and the swimming pool were up on the roof. And so I went up there, and sitting there in the sun reading a magazine was the woman that was to become my wife. We chatted and chatted and chatted, and it was like we were old friends immediately, old souls that had just met. And she was visiting Sydney at the time. And we married 9 months later, and we bought our first house in 22 By Street, Enfield. And it was the worst house in the street. We paid $60,000 for it. And then my life started changing. It changed for both of us. I started investing in the stock market, and one of the shares I'd outlaid $11,000 on a Friday with a broker by the name of Shadforths in Tasmania. And I was in Sydney at the time, but I dropped the money in their account. They bought the shares. It was a company called Ranku. And my other broker, Steve Waddell of Johnson Waddell, he said, "Why did you buy shares through them? You could have bought them through me. And in fact, if you buy any more shares, just buy them through me, and you don't have to pay until I have to settle." And so on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'd accumulated just under 5% of the capital. I sold them on the Friday, and I'd made just under $1 million for an outlay of $11,000. I also came up with an idea previous to that of doing a takeover of a company called Oil Search. The capitalisation at the time was $60 million, and I put together a deal with a West Australian entrepreneur, although I didn't deal with him at the time. I dealt with one of his subsidiary companies called Paragon Resources. And the deal was that I would get 15% of the profits from them deploying a strategy that I had designed. I didn't have to put any money in, I didn't have to take any risk. And I remember at the time when I flew over, my wife was afraid about being left at home on her own, but she was also excited for the possibilities of this business doing well. And I got over there and I walked into the boardroom, and they were at Paragon, and there were half a dozen people there, and Stan Lewis, the managing director, got me to get up on a whiteboard and outlay my strategy, and I did. And by the time I got back to the hotel, the phone rang, and Stan said, "You've got a deal, come round in the morning and sign." And that made me a millionaire by 25. It was around this time that I felt that there was something wrong with Mum. I phoned her up, and she was in a bad way. And I phoned Dave Stewart, my manager at the Commonwealth Bank. I said to Dave, "I need to get money there to my mum now. I needed to be able to get out of that house now." And he phoned me back and he said, "All right, I'm going to send the money right now." I didn't even have to sign any paperwork at that stage. He got the money there, and Mum went to the bank. And she picked up the money and she fled. And she went to where she grew up, Foxton Beach. And Mum, being the entrepreneur, sure enough, before long she had half a dozen houses. Everything was going good. She'd finally got away from my father. And she remarried. She divorced my father and remarried a lovely guy that she knew from childhood. And Graham was a very kind man, and he treated her really well. And whenever we'd go there would always be lots of laughs and everything else. Sometimes there weren't laughs because my older brother and sister have suffered enormously over the years, with various trauma and from childhood. And there was always a conflict, but I was always optimistic that somehow things would work out. I always try to keep positive. And but my wife and I, when we were about 26, started living between Hawaii and Vancouver, British Columbia, and we had some property down in New Zealand. And then we decided that after about 5 years of marriage that it was the plan to have children, so we moved to a property that we owned, 1517 Grandview Road, Kawaha Point. It's actually a house. It's a rather strange thing, but we were sitting in Canada and we were talking about where we were going to have a family. And I was thinking about a property that I owned. I had another house there, a big one, 1 acre, 7 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms on the lakefront called Rose Cottage. But I had another property, 191 Kawaha Point Road, and I was thinking about building on the site, the sort of home that I could build, and I was sort of doing a 3D panoramic think around of that particular spot, and I was looking behind, thinking about the different levels of the house and the views and so on. And when I was thinking about the view out the back, I suddenly realised that I owned a house there that I'd forgotten about, 1517 Grandview Road. So from Canada, I phoned the real estate agents, and I said, I hope this doesn't sound silly, but I think I bought a house off you and I forgot about it. My staff or lawyers, somebody had sort of, with power of attorney, had settled while I was away. I'd put $50,000 down and the balance just came out of some account. And so the people that were living there under the previous owner, the tenants, they carried on living there. And the Taylor family, and they kept an account where they were saving the rent in it every week. Beautiful people, just beautiful people. And anyway, so we got down to New Zealand. We went around to have a look at the house that we'd never really looked at. And we rebuilt that house, and that became the home where we had, first of all, Catherine. Catherine's now 28, and then Nicholas, and then Sarah, and then finally Lucy. But when we first moved to New Zealand, I sort of didn't know what I would be doing, but being that, optimistic entrepreneur, I set up a closed-circuit television business. And I predicted that I would sell that business to Briley Investments, and I did. I sold it to Harding Signals in May 1991, and it was my birthday on the 19th of July. And I had friends from around the world coming for my birthday, and one of them was a Canadian Queen's Counsel, Irv Sherman. And we were going for a drive over to Tauranga, and it sort of set in chain a number of events that would lead to me putting in a bid to buy Matakana Island, 10,000 acres of coastal land, 24 kilometres of beautiful Pacific beachfront, and then 24 kilometres of harbour front, and covered in forestry, Pinus radiata. And the property was in receivership, and the price tag that the receivers were looking for initially was 30 plus million. And I knew that I didn't want the forestry on there, the pine plantation. I knew that I'd be able to sell that and sell other, like the sawmill and various other assets to, to offset the purchase price. But I then went to the debenture holder, Carter Holt Harvey, and I met with Sir Selwyn Cushing. He was just Selwyn Cushing at the time. He was the chairman of Carter Holt. They had taken over New Zealand Forest Products, and the property had gone into, it was vendor finance and had gone into default, and so they put the receivers in. And I said to Selwyn that the island for an earn, as far as cutting the forestry and putting it through the mill, etc., on a PE ratio of 10s justifies a price of maybe 12, 14 million at the most, and that the receivers will sit there for years if we didn't get a decent price. And so they then wrote to the receivers to say that they would sell it to me for 20 million. And I'd had talks with a Japanese company called Kanimatsu for them to buy the 17 to 34-year-old forest, and we started them at, their first offer was 8 million up front. We eventually got them to 15.75 million. So because I got the price down to 20 million, I only needed 4.25 million to close the deal. And I was recommended to a merchant bank, and the proposal that we put to the merchant bank, Far Financial out of Wellington, was that they would loan us $4.25 million, and that we would sell a 5,000 acre 1 to 16-year-old forest for $6 or $7 million, and then they would get paid back their money, but their security would be the 5,000 acre 1 to 16-year-old forest, a $7 million sawmill, a 500 acre 45-year-old eucalypt forest, plus 10,000 acres of freehold coastal land, plus our own assets. So it was a good deal. And but within days of the bank seeing our deal, they made contact with an American company called ITT Rainier, and they asked them whether or not they'd be interested in buying the 17 to 34-year-old forest for $15.6 million, which was $150,000 less than the deal that we had with Kanimatsu. But they had the privilege of that information, and they did a deal with the receivers whereabouts Far Financial ended up with the land through a company called Caldor Holding. And my first reaction was just incredible anger, I guess, and fear. I felt that the deal was a great deal, and that it was going to happen, but it didn't. And so I then had to get lawyers involved, and the lawyer, Gary Judd, he looked at the case. He said, brilliant case. I said, if you're confident, then tell me the deal. He said, well, my hourly rate is $250. I'll do it for $125 an hour, and we'll pump that up to $400 on the basis that you win. And it's going to cost you, $80,000 to $100,000 less than 2 years, slam dunk, you'll win. And so we proceeded with the litigation, and no sooner than we got into it that the Maoris were screaming out in the area that they should be the owners of the land, and they put in a road blockade, and they threatened to burn down the forests, and they lobbied through the Crown and all the rest. And anyway, the long and the short of it was that the bank and their lawyers and ITT Rainier and Ernst Law 1, they had all figured out that if the Maoris became involved, then they would gain sympathy from the courts. And so the Crown, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Lands, the Crown Law Office, Far Financial, ITT, Ernst Law, and the Maoris went to the High Court and asked for my caveats to be lifted and for the transaction to go through for them to be able to buy the land. And I'm not going to get into too many details, but things were going wrong. My lawyer wasn't protecting my rights. What was being said in court was completely false. It was like I was sitting in a theatre where actors were standing there just saying lines, and it didn't make any sense. And I sensed something was wrong, but who was I? I was an unqualified, I was nothing. These are the country's top barristers. And so I stayed silent. I didn't say anything, and the judge gave an order lifting my caveats, allowing the land to be sold. And so I ended up with 17 defendants. After 2 years, I'd spent $600,000 on lawyers. And I finally got the bank to court in 1997. It was a 4-week trial, and we hammered them. We absolutely laid them out. It was sort of, at the time, it was like we almost had to carry their witnesses out of the dock. We hammered them so much. I felt sorry for them. Justice Paul Tem, who was a papal knight, he was Irish. I think he had 10 or 11 children. He was a wonderful man. He was a wise old guy. And he wrote the judgment. The judgment was crystal clear. The judgment came out on May the 5th, 1997. It was a huge celebration. I was so excited. But that night I started getting hassles from the police. I was sitting in the celebration. A policeman from Rotorua phoned up. He was wanting to talk to me about bugging of telephones and all these sort of things. And it was just his tone. And I'd already been hassled by them. But it was getting worse. The defendants, with all of their millions that they had stolen from me. I mean, there I was funding the litigation, and there was no help. They had the benefit of what they had stolen in order to fight me. And so after I won the trial, they applied for a retrial. They went before Justice Fisher. The judge who wrote my judgment, he delivered the judgment on May the 5th. On May the 25th, he suddenly died. And then the retrial application came out. They went before Justice Fisher, the head of the commercialist, a very bright guy. And he said basically that, look, if the accusation is that Wingate bugged the telephones, let me take a look at the evidence. But in looking at the evidence, it wouldn't matter if he bugged the phones. The guilt was crystal clear. So he gave a very powerful judgment. And so those two judgments went to the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal, I lost 4-1. One judge on my side, Sir Ted Thomas, he actually emailed me just a while ago asking me to come to Auckland and go out for lunch with him. But he was the only judge on my side. The judgment that was against me, the facts were wrong, the law was wrong. And so I had to appeal that to the Privy Council. Court of Appeal cost $1 million. Now the Privy Council was costing $1 million. And I was so confident that I'd win because the Privy Council was the ultimate, it was this theatre of supposed, British aristocracy and everything that is great and proper and no mistakes. And I went, and the judgment was written by Justice John Henry, a New Zealand judge, and I lost. And when I was flying back, I was sitting there in first class because I was so confident that I'd win. And we'd gone right down to our last dollar. Even the £75 taxi fare to the airport was a struggle. And when I was sitting on the plane, I was sitting next to a Singaporean businessman. And he had just been in Switzerland for a 3-month course. His family owned most of the major hotels in Singapore. And he'd gone to a university course there for succession, family dynasties who were passing assets on to children, teaching them the do's and the don'ts, where to be careful, to think smart, get good advice, know how to assess what good advice is, and so on. We was talking about this, and he asked me about what I did, and I had my satchel briefcase down next to me, and I lifted it up, and I had these beautiful photographs of our magnificent family home and my beautiful children and beautiful wife, and I began to cry because I realized that we were going to lose everything. And he put his hand over to me and he said, look, imagine if you were going back to New Zealand for a different reason. Imagine if you were going back there because one of your family was dead. You'd be sitting here right now, you'd